The water glass exploded against the marble floor. Isabella Moretti, 6 years old, silent for 6 straight years, doctors calling it hopeless, was standing trembling. Her finger locked straight across the room at a stranger. A waitress. Nobody. Every mafia boss at that table froze mid-sentence. Bodyguards reached for their weapons. Adrian Moretti's blood turned to ice because his daughter had never spoken one single word since her mother died. Not to him, not to specialists who cost fortunes, not to anyone. Then her cracked, broken voice tore through the silence like a gunshot. One word, a word that named a woman she had never met. Mom. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, welcome. Please subscribe to the channel and stay with us until the very end of this story. And if you'd like, leave a comment below with the name of the city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Emma Carter had been on her feet for 11 hours before her shift at the restaurant even started. She woke at 5 in the morning to help her grandmother Clara into the bathroom because Clara's knees had gotten so bad that even standing for 30 seconds made her wince. Emma made oatmeal checked. Clara's blood pressure medication, kissed her forehead, and left for her first job at a diner in Queens by 6:15. By noon, she was on a subway platform changing out of her diner apron and into the black dress the catering agency required for the evening event. She ate a granola bar standing up because there was no time to sit. By the time she walked into the private event space at the restaurant that night, her feet were screaming and her mind was doing math she didn't want to do. Rent, Clara's medication, the tuition payment for the online nursing courses Emma was trying to finish 2 classes at a time whenever she had money left over, which was almost never. "You're late," said Marcus, the floor manager, without looking up from his clipboard. "I'm 4 minutes early," Emma said. "You're supposed to be here 15 minutes early. This is a Moretti event tonight. You understand what that means?" Emma didn't. Not really. She'd heard the name whispered around the industry, the way people whispered about weather that might turn violent. She just nodded and took the tray she was handed. "Smile," Marcus muttered. "And don't talk unless they talk to you first." Emma smiled the smile she'd practiced for 6 years of service jobs, the one that cost her nothing and meant nothing, and pushed through the door into the private dining room. The room was full of men in dark suits who did not smile back. At the head of the long table sat a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Adrian Moretti had dark eyes that moved across a room like he was cataloging every exit, every threat, every weakness in the people seated around him. He was maybe 35, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the kind of stillness that made other men sit up straighter without realizing they were doing it. To his right sat an older man with silver hair and a warm, easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Victor Bellini had been a friend of the Moretti family for over 20 years, a business partner, a man Adrian's late father had trusted with his life. Tonight, he was doing most of the talking, gesturing with a glass of red wine, laughing at his own jokes just a beat too long. "The shipment numbers work if we route through Newark instead of the docks directly," Victor was saying. "Cleaner, fewer eyes." "And more middlemen," Adrian said flatly. "I don't like middlemen, Victor. You know that." "I know you like control," Victor said, smiling wider. "But sometimes control costs more than it's worth." Adrian didn't answer. His eyes had drifted just for a second toward the small private alcove near the back of the room where a nanny sat with a little girl coloring quietly at a low table. Isabella, 6 years old, dark curls like her mother's. A face that could have been carved from porcelain, beautiful and still and utterly silent. She had not spoken a word since she was born. No, that wasn't quite right. She had spoken once as a baby the ordinary babbling sounds infants make. Then the night her mother Sophia died, something in her simply closed like a door slamming shut, and it had never opened again. Adrian had spent 4 years and more money than most people would see in a lifetime trying to find the key. Dr. Whitfield in Boston. Dr. Reyes at Johns Hopkins. A specialist flown in from London who charged $8,000 an hour and left after 3 sessions saying only, There's nothing wrong with her hearing Mr. Moretti. There's something she's protecting herself from remembering. Protecting herself from what exactly was the question that kept Adrian awake most nights. Mr. Moretti. Victor's voice pulled him back. You were saying about Newark. I was saying no, Adrian said. We do it my way, or we don't do it. Around the table, a few of the men exchanged glances. Nobody argued with Adrian Moretti when his voice went that flat and quiet. Victor's smile flickered just barely before he raised his glass in mock surrender. Your way then, Victor said. Always your way. Emma moved through the room, refilling water glasses, clearing empty plates, keeping her eyes down the way Marcus had told her to. She was good at being invisible. She'd had a lot of practice. She didn't notice the little girl in the corner watching her. Isabella had stopped coloring. Her crayon sat frozen against the paper, a half-finished sun with no rays. Her dark eyes were locked on the waitress moving between the tables, on the particular way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, on the small, tired, half-smile she gave an elderly man who thanked her for refilling his glass. Something in Isabella's chest, something that had been locked tight for 6 years, gave a single hard thud. The nanny, a young woman named Priya, noticed Isabella had stopped drawing and leaned down. Everything okay, sweetheart? Isabella didn't answer. She never answered. But her small hand had curled into a fist on the table, and her breathing had gone shallow and quick. Emma moved closer, clearing a tray of empty appetizer plates from a table near the alcove. She hummed softly to herself, an old habit from working double shifts. Something to keep her mind from the exhaustion in her legs. It was a tune her grandmother used to sing to her when she was small. Isabella's head snapped toward the sound. Her whole body went rigid. Priya frowned, reaching for the girl's shoulder. Isabella, honey, what is it? Across the room, deep in a conversation about a business associate whose loyalty was in question, Adrian caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned, and what he saw made his blood run cold. His daughter was standing. Isabella never stood up during dinner. Isabella never did anything unpredictable. She was a creature of routine, of careful stillness, of silence, so total it had become its own kind of language. But she was standing now, chair scraping back, small body trembling, and her eyes were fixed on the waitress across the room with an intensity that made every hardened man at that table stop talking. Isabella, Adrian said, rising halfway from his seat. Baby, sit down. She didn't sit down. Her hand came up slow and shaking finger extended, and she pointed directly at Emma Carter. The room went dead silent. Emma felt the silence before she understood it. She turned tray still balanced against her hip and found every single person in that private dining room staring at her, and at the small child pointing straight at her chest. I'm sorry, Emma said automatically, the way you apologize for existing in a room full of powerful people. Did I do something wrong? Nobody answered. Victor Bellini's easy smile had vanished completely. His eyes had gone sharp, calculating, flicking between Isabella and Emma with an expression that lasted only a second before he smoothed it back into polite confusion. Adrian was already moving chair, scraping back hard, crossing the room in long strides. Isabella, look at me. She didn't look at him. Her lips parted. Priya, kneeling beside her now, whispered, Sweetheart, you don't have to. It's okay, you don't have to say anything. But Isabella was going to say something. 6 years of silence had built up behind that small closed door, and now, for reasons nobody in that room understood, the door was cracking open. Mom. One word. Small, cracked, unpracticed, like a voice remembering how to work after being unused for years. The water glass in front of her tipped from the movement of her arm and shattered against the marble floor, and the sound of breaking glass seemed to echo through the frozen room like a gunshot. Adrian stopped dead in the middle of the floor. For a moment, nobody moved. Not the bodyguard standing near the door whose hands had instinctively gone toward their jackets. Not the businessmen at the table who had gone pale with the kind of fear that comes from witnessing something they don't understand in a room controlled by dangerous men. Not Victor, whose knuckles had gone white around the stem of his wineglass. Emma stood frozen tray, shaking slightly in her hands, staring at the little girl who had just called her mom. I'm sorry, Emma stammered. I think there's been some kind of mistake. I don't know your daughter, sir. I promise you I've never seen her before in my life. Adrian turned to look at her, and Emma had never in her life seen a man's face hold so many things at once. Disbelief. Grief. Something that looked dangerously close to hope, quickly buried beneath suspicion. She hasn't spoken in 6 years, Adrian said quietly. Too quietly. The kind of quiet that made the men at the table lean forward to hear him. Not one word. Not to me. Not to doctors who cost more than most people's houses. Not to her own mother's family. He took a step closer to Emma. And she just called you Mom. Emma's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to put the tray down, walk out the door, and never come back to this restaurant again. I don't know what to tell you, she said, voice shaking. I've never met her before tonight. I don't know why she'd say that. Isabella broke free of Priya's gentle grip and ran. Not toward Adrian. Toward Emma. Small arms wrapped around Emma's waist, gripping her uniform with a desperate strength that seemed impossible for such a small child, and Isabella pressed her face into the fabric of Emma's dress and began violently to shake with tears she had no words for. Emma's tray clattered to the ground. Her arms came up instinctively, the way any woman's arms would come up around a crying child, and she found herself holding a mafia boss's daughter in the middle of the most dangerous private dining room in Manhattan, with 24 armed men staring at her like she'd just detonated a bomb. Get her off, one of the men at the table muttered under his breath to another. Moretti, what is this? Go quiet, Adrian snapped without turning his head. Victor rose slowly from his seat, smoothing his jacket, his expression carefully arranged back into something like concern. Adrian, perhaps we should clear the room. This is a delicate situation. You think, Adrian said, and for the first time that night, something raw broke through his controlled voice. He crouched down in front of Emma and his daughter, his eyes level with Isabella's shaking shoulders, and his voice when he spoke again had none of the coldness he'd used with Victor moments earlier. Isabella, baby, look at me. Isabella didn't lift her head from Emma's dress. Please, Adrian said, and the word cracked slightly. Please look at me. Slowly, reluctantly, the little girl turned her face just enough to look at her father, tears streaking down her cheeks. One small hand still fisted in Emma's uniform, like she was afraid the woman would disappear if she let go. Why did you say that? Adrian asked softly. Why did you call her that? Isabella's mouth opened, closed, opened again. For a moment, it seemed like the door had slammed shut once more, that the single word had been all she had, a strange, unexplainable fluke that would never repeat itself. Then, so quiet that only the people closest could hear it, Isabella whispered, She smells like her. The room seemed to tilt. Adrian's face went white. What did you say? She smells like Mom, Isabella whispered again, burying her face back into Emma's dress. She smells like Mom did. Emma felt the little girl trembling against her, felt the desperate grip of small fingers, and something in her own chest, something she didn't understand, ached in response. I don't understand, Emma said, looking up at Adrian, her voice barely above a whisper. I've never met your wife. I don't even know who you are, sir. I'm sorry, I just work catering events, I don't. Adrian Moretti. Victor cut in smoothly, stepping closer with his easy practiced charm restored. And this is, I'm sure, a very confused and very tired little girl who's had a long night. Misses it? Perhaps it's best if you finish your shift and we let the family handle this privately. Something about the way Victor said it, smooth, dismissive, almost too eager to end the moment, made Adrian's eyes narrow slightly. But he didn't argue. Not yet. Not in front of the room. Isabella, Adrian said gently. Can you let go of, I'm sorry, miss, what's your name? Emma, she said. Emma Carter. Can you let go of Emma's dress so she can get back to work? Isabella's grip tightened instead. No, she whispered, and it was the third word she'd spoken in 6 years, and it hit Adrian like a physical blow. No, don't make her leave. Marcus, the floor manager, had appeared in the doorway drawn by the commotion. His face a mixture of horror and confusion at seeing one of his waitresses at the center of whatever this was. Emma is everything. Do you need me to, sir? I apologize deeply for whatever has happened. I can pull her from the floor immediately. No, Adrian said, holding up a hand. No, that's everyone, please. Just give us a moment. He crouched lower, bringing himself fully to his daughter's eye level, ignoring the room full of men watching him, ignoring Victor's carefully neutral expression, ignoring everything except the small, trembling girl who had just spoken more words in the last 2 minutes than she had in 6 years. Isabella, he said softly. I need you to breathe for me, okay? Can you do that? Isabella's shoulders hitched with a shaky breath. I'm not going to make Emma go anywhere she doesn't want to go, Adrian said carefully. But I need to talk to her. Can I do that? Can you let her talk to me for just a minute? It took nearly 30 seconds that felt like an hour to everyone standing frozen in that room before Isabella's grip on Emma's dress loosened just slightly. Emma knelt down slowly, bringing herself level with the little girl, some instinct she didn't fully understand taking over. Hey, Emma said softly. It's okay. I'm not going anywhere far. Okay, I'll be right here. Isabella studied her face for a long moment, dark eyes searching Emma's features, like she was looking for something specific, something she recognized. Then so quietly, it was almost a breath, she said, "Promise." Emma's chest tightened in a way she didn't expect. "I promise," she said. Isabella let go. Adrian stood running a hand roughly through his hair, and for the first time Emma saw past the expensive suit and the dangerous stillness to the man underneath a father who had clearly spent years grieving, a silence he couldn't fix, now standing in the wreckage of whatever had just happened. "Miss Carter," he said. "Emma, I know this looks insane. I know I look insane, but I need to ask you some questions and I'm willing to make it worth your time. I don't want your money," Emma said, straightening her voice steadier now, even though her hands were still shaking. "I want to understand why your daughter just grabbed onto me like I was her mother. Because that's terrifying, sir. That's actually terrifying. It's terrifying for me too," Adrian said quietly, and something about the honesty in his voice caught Emma off guard. She hasn't spoken since her mother died 4 years ago, not once. Not to me, not to her grandmother, not to anyone. And in the last 5 minutes, she's said more words than she's said in the last 4 years combined. Behind him, Victor cleared his throat. "Adrian, perhaps this conversation would be better suited somewhere more private. We do still have business to conclude tonight." "The business can wait," Adrian said, not turning around. Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course." Marcus was hovering nearby, wringing his hands. "Sir, I really must insist Emma has other tables in this event. We have contractual obligations. I'll cover whatever the restaurant loses tonight," Adrian said, pulling a card from his jacket without even looking at Marcus. "Double it. I need 15 minutes with Miss Carter." Marcus's protest died in his throat the second he saw the card. Emma looked down at Isabella, who was still standing close. One small hand now looped loosely through Emma's fingers, refusing to fully let go, even now that the crisis had passed. 15 minutes. Emma said, mostly to herself, trying to convince her own racing heart that this was a reasonable thing to agree to. "Okay, fine. 15 minutes. Adrian gestured toward a quieter corner of the room, away from the table of watching men, and Emma found herself walking there with a 6-year-old's hand still wrapped around hers, unwilling to release its grip. Behind them at the long table, Victor Bellini sat back down slowly, his expression unreadable, and reached for his phone beneath the table thumb, moving quickly, silently typing something to someone Emma would never see. "Tell me," Adrian said, once they'd stepped far enough away that the murmur of the other men blended into background noise. "Everything you can think of. Where did you grow up? Who's your family? Have you ever, and I know this sounds insane, have you ever met a woman named Sophia Moretti? Emma shook her head slowly. I've never heard that name in my life before tonight. I grew up in Queens. My parents died when I was 17 in a car accident. My grandmother raised me after that. Her name is Clara Carter. I work 2 jobs. I've never been anywhere near whatever world you're part of, sir. I promise you that. Something flickered behind Adrian's eyes at the mention of Clara's name, so brief and so quickly buried that Emma almost missed it entirely. Clara Carter, he repeated slowly. Your grandmother? Yes? Emma said, frowning slightly at the strange way he said it. Why do you know her? No, Adrian said too quickly. No, I don't think so. It's a common enough name. But Emma had grown up reading people, reading rooms, reading the exact moment a customer was about to complain before they even opened their mouth. And she knew a lie when she heard one, even a small one, even one wrapped in genuine confusion. Isabella tugged gently on Emma's hand and looked up at her with an expression far too old for a 6-year-old's face. Will you come back? She whispered. Emma's throat tightened unexpectedly. Sweetheart, I don't even know your family. I don't know if that's... Please, Isabella said, and it was the most words strung together that Adrian had heard from his daughter in 4 years, and his hands had curled into fists at his sides just listening to it. Please, you have to come back. I've been waiting. The words hit the room like ice water. Waiting for what? Adrian asked carefully, kneeling again in front of his daughter. Isabella, baby, waiting for what? Isabella's eyes filled with tears again, and this time when she spoke, her voice was barely more than breath. I don't remember, she whispered. I just know I was waiting. Adrian looked up at Emma over his daughter's head, and in his eyes Emma saw something that terrified her more than the guns she assumed the men at that table were carrying, more than the reputation she'd heard whispered in kitchens across the city. She saw a man who had just realized his daughter's silence had never been random, and she saw underneath that the first flicker of a suspicion he wasn't ready to say out loud, yet a suspicion that somehow, impossibly, this exhausted waitress standing in front of him was connected to the death of his wife. Emma, Adrian said slowly, standing. I need to see you again. Not tonight. Not like this. But soon. I'll pay whatever you need. I'll work around whatever schedule you have. I just need to understand what's happening to my daughter. Emma looked down at Isabella, at the small hand still refusing to fully release hers, at the desperate hope written across a child's face that had apparently forgotten how to hope at all. Every instinct built over years of hard, careful survival told her to say no. To walk away from this dangerous, wealthy, frightening man and his family, and go back to her small, exhausting, but predictable life. But Isabella was looking up at her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had been shifting under her feet for years. And Emma felt something crack open in her own chest, something she didn't have a name for yet. Okay, she heard herself say. Okay, I'll come back, once, just to make sure she's all right. Isabella's grip finally loosened, and for the first time that night, the ghost of something that might have once been a smile touched the corner of her mouth. Behind them, unnoticed, Victor Bellini rose quietly from the table phone pressed to his ear as he stepped toward the exit. His voice a low murmur that carried only a single fragment of sentence before the door closed behind him. We have a problem, he said. The Carter girl just walked back into this family's life. Emma didn't hear it. Adrian didn't hear it. Only the closing door and the empty hallway beyond heard the quiet, calculated fear in Victor Bellini's voice. The fear of a man who had spent years making sure a certain truth stayed buried, and who had just watched in a single unplanned moment 6 years of careful silence come undone. Outside, the city moved on the way it always did, indifferent to the small, cracked word that had just changed the direction of every life in that room. Emma walked out of the restaurant that night with a business card in her coat pocket, a phone number she didn't remember agreeing to give, and a strange, hollow ache in her chest that she couldn't explain, an ache that felt impossibly like recognition. When she got home, Clara was still awake, sitting in her worn armchair with the television murmuring low in the background. "You're late," Clara said, not looking up from her crossword puzzle. "Long night." Emma hesitated in the doorway, still holding the strange, unsettled feeling in her chest, like something fragile she didn't want to drop. "Grandma," she said slowly, "have you ever heard the name Moretti before?" Clara's pen stopped moving. She didn't look up right away. When she finally did, her face had gone pale in a way Emma had never seen before, not even during the worst of her health scares, and her hands, when she set down the crossword puzzle, were trembling. "Where did you hear that name?" Clara asked, and her voice had a tightness to it that made the hollow ache in Emma's chest turn into something colder, sharper, something that felt very much like fear. Clara's hands trembled around the crossword puzzle in her lap, the pen rolling off the page and onto the floor without either of them reaching for it. "Grandma," Emma said again, stepping fully into the small living room, now her coat still damp from the rain outside. "Why does that name scare you?" "It doesn't scare me," Clara said, but her voice cracked in the middle of the word scare, and both of them heard it. "You just went white as a sheet. I'm 71 years old, Emma. I go white when I stand up too fast." Clara reached down slowly, painfully for the fallen pen, using the movement as an excuse to look away from her granddaughter's face. "Where did you hear that name tonight?" Emma sat down on the arm of the old couch, still catching her breath from the walk up 3 flights of stairs, still feeling the ghost of a small hand wrapped around her fingers. "I was working a private event. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, she pointed at me across the room and called me Mom, in front of everyone. Then her father came over, and his name was Adrian Moretti." The pen slipped out of Clara's hand a second time. This time, she didn't reach for it. "Grandma." Emma's voice had gone very quiet. "Talk to me." Clara sat very still for a long moment, staring at some fixed point on the worn carpet, her jaw working the way it did when she was deciding how much of something to say and how much to swallow. "I worked at Lennox Memorial for 11 years. Clara said finally, "before you were born and for a while after. Labor and delivery floor, then eventually maternity intensive care." "I know that. You've told me that 100 times. I never told you about the Moretti case." Emma felt something cold slide down the back of her neck. "What Moretti case?" Clara's hands folded together in her lap, knuckles pale. "There was a young woman," she said slowly, "who came in for what should have been a routine delivery. Complicated pregnancy, but nothing that should have ended the way it did. She died 2 days after giving birth. Officially, it was ruled a hemorrhage complication. Nobody's fault. Just one of those terrible things that happen sometimes in medicine, no matter how careful everyone is." "Officially," Emma repeated. Clara looked up at her, and there were tears standing in her eyes now. Old tears, the kind that had been held back for years and had simply forgotten how to fall. "I was the nurse on shift that night," she said. "And I saw things in her chart that didn't add up. Medication logs that had been altered. A blood transfusion that should have happened and never did. I raised questions. I raised them loudly to my supervisor, to the hospital administrator, and within a week I was told my questions were, and I remember this phrase exactly, unhelpful to hospital operations. 'They fired you.' They didn't need to fire me," Clara said bitterly. "A man came to see me. Very well dressed, very polite. He told me that my questions had been heard and noted, and that continuing to ask them would not be good for my health or for yours." Emma's stomach dropped. "For mine, Grandma, I wasn't even born yet." "You were 7 years old," Clara said quietly. "Your parents were still alive, and this man made it very clear, without ever raising his voice, without ever saying a single threatening word directly, that my family's safety depended on my silence. So I stopped asking questions. I put in for a transfer to a different floor. And 18 months later, I left nursing altogether." The room had gone completely silent, except for the murmur of the television, some late-night talk show host laughing at his own joke to an audience that didn't exist for Clara and Emma right now. "The young woman who died," Emma said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Was her name Sophia?" Clara's eyes closed. "Yes," she said. "Sophia Moretti." Emma stood up so fast the couch cushion beside her tipped sideways. "Grandma, this is insane. This is actually insane. A little girl grabbed onto me tonight like I was her dead mother, and now you're telling me you were there when her mother died, and that someone threatened you into silence about it. I'm telling you to stay away from that family," Clara said, and for the first time her voice had real fear in it, sharp and immediate. "Emma, I don't know why that little girl reacted to you the way she did. Maybe it's a coincidence. Maybe you remind her of someone. But that family, that name it, is not safe. Do you understand me? It was never safe." "He gave me his card," Emma said. "Adrian Moretti. He wants to see me again." Clara's face went from pale to ashen. "Give me the card," she said. "Give it to me right now, and I will burn it in the sink." "Grandma." "Emma Rose Carter, give me that card." "I already told him I would see him again," Emma said quietly. "There's a little girl who hasn't spoken in 4 years, and tonight she said more words to me than she's apparently said to anyone in that entire time. I can't just walk away from that." Clara sat back in her chair, and something in her posture seemed to fold inward, the fight draining out of her all at once, replaced by an exhaustion that looked bone deep. "Your mother," Clara said quietly, "used to say the exact same thing, that she couldn't walk away from people who needed her. It's why she became a teacher instead of doing something safer. It's a good quality, Emma. It's also going to be the thing that gets you hurt someday." "I'm not going back for him," Emma said. "I'm going back for her. That's exactly what worries me." Emma knelt down in front of her grandmother's chair, taking the old woman's trembling hands in her own. "Tell me everything," Emma said. "Everything you remember about that night. I need to know what I'm walking into." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her thumb moving absently over Emma's knuckles, the way it had when Emma was a small girl afraid of thunderstorms. "There was a transfusion order in her chart," Clara said finally, "for a rare blood type. A B negative. It should have been flagged immediately, cross-matched, prepared within the hour. Instead, the order sat for nearly 3 hours before anyone acted on it. By the time they brought the blood up, she had already lost too much." "Why would someone delay a transfusion order?" "That," Clara said, "is the question I asked, and it's the question that got me a visit from a man in an expensive suit. Do you remember his name, the man who threatened you?" Clara shook her head slowly. "He never gave one, but I remember his face. I would know it anywhere, even after all these years." Emma thought of the long table in that private dining room, of the dozen men in dark suits, of the one man with silver hair, and an easy smile that didn't reach his eyes, the one who had stepped in so smoothly to suggest Emma finish her shift and let the family handle things privately. "Was he older?" Emma asked slowly. "Silver hair, very charming, very polished, like he'd practiced being likable his whole life." Clara's grip on Emma's hands tightened sharply. "How do you know that—" "There was a man at the dinner tonight," Emma said, "sitting right next to Adrian Moretti. He seemed very eager to get me out of that room the second Isabella started talking." "Isabella," Clara repeated softly. "That's her name, the little girl." "Yes." Clara's eyes filled with tears again, and this time one slipped free and traced down the deep lines of her cheek. "Sophia was going to name her daughter Isabella. She told me the night before the delivery when I was checking her vitals. She said if it was a girl she wanted to name her after her own grandmother." The two women sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the coincidence settling over the small living room like a physical thing. "I have to go back," Emma said finally. "Grandma, I have to know what happened to that woman, and I think Isabella knows something, even if she doesn't have the words for it yet." "Then you go carefully," Clara said, her voice fierce despite its tremor. "You go with your eyes open, and you do not under any circumstances trust a man named Victor if that's who you saw tonight. Promise me that much." "I promise," Emma said. She didn't sleep that night. She lay awake staring at the water stain on her bedroom ceiling, replaying the moment Isabella's small arms had wrapped around her waist, replaying the desperate whisper of, "Please don't make her leave," replaying the flicker of something dangerous and calculating in Victor Bellini's eyes before he'd smoothed it back into polite concern. By morning, she had made a decision. She would see Isabella again, but she would go into that world with her eyes open exactly like Clara had said. 3 days later, a black car pulled up outside the diner where Emma worked her morning shift, and a driver in a dark suit stepped out to hold the door open for her during her 15-minute break, an arrangement she would later learn that Adrian had made through a call to the diner's owner, and a very generous donation to keep Emma's job secure regardless of how often she needed time away. "Mr. Moretti sends his apologies for the informal arrangement," the driver said. "He would have come himself, but Isabella insisted on waiting at home in case you said yes today." Emma's chest tightened at that. "She's been waiting every day since the dinner," the driver said. "She sits by the window." Emma got in the car. The Moretti estate was nothing like she expected, or rather, it was exactly like she expected, and somehow worse, an enormous stone house set behind iron gates and a long driveway lined with old oak trees. The kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself because it had never once doubted its own permanence. Adrian was waiting on the front steps when the car pulled up, and Emma noted with some surprise that he looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that came from sleepless nights, rather than simple hard work. "Thank you for coming," he said, opening her door himself before the driver could reach it. "I know I asked a lot showing up at your job like this." "Where is she?" Emma asked, skipping past the pleasantries. "Inside, waiting by the window exactly like Marco told you, I'm guessing." Emma followed him up the steps and through a front door that opened into a foyer larger than her entire apartment, but she barely registered the marble floors or the sweeping staircase because Isabella was already running toward her across the entryway, small feet slapping against stone, dark curls bouncing. "You came?" Isabella said, breathless, throwing her arms around Emma's waist, exactly the way she had 3 nights earlier. "You came back. I told you I would," Emma said softly, crouching down to the girl's level. Isabella pulled back just enough to look at Emma's face, studying her with the same searching intensity from before, and then very quietly she said, "I dreamed about you last night." Adrian went very still behind them. "What did you dream?" Emma asked carefully. "We were in a kitchen," Isabella said, "and you were making pancakes, and you were singing the song you hummed at the dinner. The one about the little bird." Emma's heart stuttered. The song she'd been humming at the restaurant without even fully realizing she was doing it had been an old lullaby her own grandmother used to sing to her about a little bird that couldn't find its way home. It wasn't a famous song. It wasn't something Isabella could have heard anywhere else unless... "Isabella," Adrian said carefully, kneeling down beside them both. "Where do you think you heard that song before?" Isabella's small face scrunched in concentration, the way children's faces do when they're reaching for a memory just out of grasp. "I don't know," she said finally, frustration creeping into her voice. "I just know it. I've always known it." "Has she ever heard that song?" Emma asked, looking up at Adrian. "From anyone? A nanny? A babysitter? Anything?" "Not that I know of," Adrian said slowly. "But she was barely 2 years old when her mother died. If Sophia sang it to her as an infant, it's possible the memory is buried somewhere Isabella can't consciously access, but her body remembers." "That's not how memory works in 2-year-olds, Emma said. "Is it?" "I don't know," Adrian admitted. "None of the specialists I hired ever mentioned anything like this. They kept telling me her silence was trauma-related, that she was protecting herself from a memory of the night her mother died. But nobody ever explained why she'd be protecting herself from a song about a bird." Isabella tugged on Emma's sleeve. "Will you sing it again?" "The bird song." Emma glanced at Adrian, who nodded slowly, and then began to hum quiet and unsteady. At first, the melody her own grandmother had sung to her 1,000 times as a child. Isabella closed her eyes. Her small body swayed slightly with the tune, and her lips moved almost silently, shaping words that Emma hadn't even sung yet. Words to a verse Emma herself hadn't spoken aloud. And when Emma reached that verse, actually sang the words, instead of just humming. Isabella's mouth formed them perfectly, half a beat behind like a memory surfacing from somewhere far beneath conscious thought. Adrian's hand had come up to cover his mouth. "She's never heard those words," he said, voice thick. "Emma, I swear to you she's never heard those exact words. I would know. I've spent 4 years cataloging every single sound that's ever come near her, hoping something would unlock her." "Then how does she know them?" Emma whispered. Neither of them had an answer. Isabella opened her eyes and looked between the two adults, sensing the sudden tension without understanding it, and her small face crumpled with the beginning of confusion, maybe fear. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked. "No, baby. No," Adrian said quickly, pulling her into a hug. "No, you didn't do anything wrong. You did something wonderful. I just need a minute, okay?" He stood guiding Emma a few steps away, while Isabella returned to the window seat, humming the bird song quietly to herself, tracing patterns on the glass with one finger. "I need to ask you something," Adrian said quietly once they were out of earshot. "And I need you to be completely honest with me, even if the answer scares you." "Okay." "Did your grandmother ever work in a hospital? A maternity ward specifically?" Emma's blood went cold. She hadn't told him that. She hadn't told him anything about Clara beyond her name 3 nights ago, before he'd had that strange buried flicker of recognition cross his face. "Why would you ask that?" she said carefully. "Because the name Clara Carter isn't unfamiliar to me," Adrian said. "I found it in my late wife's medical file 2 years ago, buried in a stack of old records I finally worked up the courage to go through. A nurse named Clara Carter had documented irregularities in Sophia's chart the night she died. Irregularities that were never formally investigated because the case was closed before anyone thought to ask why." Emma felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. "My grandmother told me last night," she said slowly, "that she worked the night your wife died, that she saw something wrong in the chart, a delayed blood transfusion, and that a man came to see her afterward and told her without ever raising his voice that continuing to ask questions would not be good for her family's safety." Adrian's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping visibly beneath his skin. "Did she describe the man?" "Silver hair," Emma said quietly. "Charming, polished, the kind of smile that doesn't reach his eyes." Adrian's face had gone very pale, very still, the particular stillness of a man doing everything in his power not to explode in front of his own daughter. "Victor," he said, barely more than a breath. "I don't know his last name," Emma said. "I only know she recognized the description of the man sitting next to you at that table 3 nights ago." Adrian turned away from her, walking a few steps toward the enormous window overlooking the estate's back gardens, his hands braced against the sill shoulders rigid. "Victor Bellini has been my father's business partner for over 20 years. Adrian said, his voice tight and controlled in a way that scared Emma more than shouting would have. "He was at my wedding. He was in the waiting room the night Isabella was born. He gave the eulogy at Sophia's funeral because I was too broken to speak. And if what my grandmother says is true," Emma said quietly, "he may have had something to do with why she died." Adrian didn't answer right away. When he finally turned back around, his eyes had a hardness in them that hadn't been there minutes earlier. The same dangerous stillness Emma had seen across the dining room 3 nights ago. The version of him that had made a room full of powerful men fall silent with a single flat sentence. "I need to see those old hospital records," he said. "The originals, not whatever sanitized version made it into the official file. Does your grandmother still have anything? Notes, copies, anything at all?" "I don't know," Emma admitted. "She's never mentioned keeping anything. She spent years trying to forget this ever happened." "Would she talk to me?" Emma hesitated. "She told me very specifically not to trust anyone with the last name Moretti or Bellini. I don't think she's going to be eager to sit down for a conversation with you." "Then I'll earn it," Adrian said. "However long it takes." From across the room, Isabella's small voice drifted over, still humming the bird song, and both adults turned to look at her. This quiet, strange, impossible child who had somehow cracked open a door that had been sealed for 6 years, who had reached across an unbridgeable gap of wealth and danger and grief to grab the hand of a stranger who happened to carry a memory she shouldn't have been able to access at all. "Adrian," Emma said slowly, "what if this isn't a coincidence? What if Isabella recognizing me isn't about scent or songs at all? What are you suggesting?" "I don't know," Emma admitted. "I just have this feeling ever since that night, like there's a piece of this puzzle none of us can see yet." Neither of them noticed Isabella had stopped humming. The little girl was staring out the window down at the long driveway below, where a black car had just pulled through the estate's front gates, moving slowly up toward the house. "He's here," Isabella said quietly. Adrian frowned, crossing to the window. "Who's here, baby?" Isabella's small hand pressed flat against the glass, and her voice, when she spoke again, had dropped to something barely audible, something that made the hair on the back of Emma's neck stand up. "The man from my dream," Isabella whispered. "The one who was there. The bad one." Adrian's whole body went rigid. Down in the driveway, the car rolled to a stop, and the driver's side door opened. Victor Bellini stepped out, smoothing the front of his jacket, and looked up toward the house with an easy, practiced smile that did absolutely nothing to soften the cold, calculating flicker in his eyes. "Adrian!" Victor called out cheerfully as he approached the front steps. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I heard our little waitress friend was back for a visit, and I thought it might be time the three of us had a proper conversation." Adrian's hand found Emma's arm, not gripping hard, but firm, deliberate, a silent signal. "Don't say anything about your grandmother," he murmured, barely moving his lips. "Not yet. Not until I understand exactly what we're dealing with." Emma's heart was hammering as Victor's footsteps echoed up the marble hallway, drawing closer, and behind her, Isabella had gone completely silent again. Small body pressed against the window glass, eyes fixed on the approaching man with an expression of pure, wordless fear that made Emma's stomach twist into a knot. "Well," Victor said, stepping into the foyer, his smile widening as his eyes landed on Emma. "Miss Carter, I have to say I didn't expect Adrian to move quite this fast. It's only been a few days." "Victor," Adrian said evenly, though Emma could feel the tension radiating off him. "This isn't a good time." "On the contrary," Victor said, spreading his hands in a gesture of easy, harmless welcome. "I think this is exactly the right time. There are some things Miss Carter should probably understand about the family she's stumbled into before she gets in any deeper." "What kind of things?" Emma asked, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. Victor's smile flickered something sharp, passing briefly behind his eyes before it smoothed back into charm. "For instance," he said, "did Adrian happen to mention that his wife's death has never been fully explained? That there are still open questions about that night? Questions that certain people believe are better left buried for everyone's safety?" "Victor!" Adrian said, his voice dropping into something dangerously flat. "That's enough." "Is it?" Victor said, tilting his head slightly, studying Adrian's face with an expression of mild, curious interest. "Because it seems to me, old friend, that you've been very busy these last few days, digging through old files, asking questions you haven't asked in years. I wonder what brought that on." Emma's blood ran cold. He knew. Somehow he already knew Adrian had been going through the old records. "You've had someone watching me," Adrian said slowly, and it wasn't a question. Victor's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went very still, very careful. "I keep an eye on the people I care about," Victor said smoothly. "Especially when they start acting erratically, chasing after waitresses, digging through old grief. It's not healthy, Adrian. Sophia wouldn't want this for you." "Don't," Adrian said, and the single word carried a warning sharper than any shout could have. "Don't say her name." Isabella, still standing by the window, made a small, frightened sound, and Victor's gaze slid toward her, and for just a fraction of a second, something colder than mere annoyance passed across his features. "She's looking well," Victor said, nodding toward Isabella. "Talking again, I hear. What a remarkable turn of events. Almost suspiciously well-timed, don't you think?" "Watch yourself," Adrian said quietly. I'm simply making an observation, Victor said, holding up both hands in mock innocence. A little girl who hasn't spoken in 4 years suddenly finds her voice right around the same time you start pulling old hospital files. It does make a person wonder if these things are connected. Are they? Emma asked before she could stop herself. Victor's eyes swung toward her sharp and assessing, and for a moment the charming mask slipped entirely, revealing something colder underneath, something that made Emma's pulse spike with real fear. That, Victor said softly, is a very good question, Miss Carter. Perhaps you should ask your grandmother. The room went dead silent. Adrian's hand tightened on Emma's arm. How do you know about her grandmother? He asked, and his voice had gone deadly quiet in a way that made even Victor pause. Victor's smile returned easy and untroubled, as though he hadn't just revealed something he shouldn't have known. Small world, Adrian, he said lightly. I make it my business to know things. Comes with the territory of keeping this family safe for 20 years. Get out, Adrian said. Adrian. Get out of my house, Victor. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, decades of history and buried tension coiled tight between them, and Emma had the distinct, terrifying sense of standing in the middle of something far larger and far more dangerous than she had ever intended to walk into. Finally, Victor inclined his head, the picture of gracious retreat. Of course, he said. I'll leave you to your reunion. But Adrian, a word of advice from someone who has spent 20 years protecting this family from itself. Digging up the past rarely brings the peace people think it will. Sometimes the past stays buried for a reason. He turned footsteps unhurried and made his way back down the marble hallway toward the front door, pausing only once at the threshold to glance back at Emma with an expression that made her stomach drop through the floor. Welcome to the family, Miss Carter, he said softly. I do hope you know what you're getting yourself into. The door closed behind him with a heavy final click. For a long moment, nobody in the foyer moved. Then Isabella crossed the room quickly, wrapping both arms around Emma's waist, again her small body trembling. He scares me, she whispered. He's always scared me. Even when I couldn't talk, I could feel it. Adrian knelt down, gathering his daughter close his face, a mask of barely contained fury and fear. I promise you, he said. He will never hurt you, either of you. His eyes found Emma's over Isabella's shoulder. I need to know everything your grandmother told you. Tonight if possible. Because if Victor already knows about her, that means we're running out of time to figure out exactly what he's afraid we'll find. Emma's hands had gone cold. You think he's dangerous, she said. Actually dangerous, not just unpleasant. I think, Adrian said slowly, choosing each word with visible care, that Victor Bellini has spent 20 years being the most trusted man in this family's life, and I think everything I believed about my wife's death might have been a lie he helped construct. And I think a man who is capable of that is capable of protecting that lie by whatever means necessary. Isabella's grip on Emma tightened. Don't let him find Grandma Clara, she whispered, and both adults froze, staring down at the little girl in shock. What did you say? Emma asked, carefully crouching down. Isabella, how do you know that name? Isabella blinked, confusion clouding her small face, as though she herself didn't fully understand where the words had come from. I don't know, she said, frightened now. It just came out. Like the song did. Adrian and Emma exchanged a look over the child's head, a look that carried the full terrifying weight of a question neither of them was ready to voice aloud. Yet a question that would follow them through every conversation that came after this one. How did a 6-year-old girl silent for 4 years know the name of a woman she had never met? Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from an unknown number sent only moments after Victor Bellini had walked out that front door. She pulled it out with shaking hands, and the words on the screen sent a jolt of pure ice through her entire body. I know where your grandmother lives, Miss Carter. I do hope she's being careful these days. Adrian, Emma said, her voice breaking. We need to get to my grandmother's apartment, right now. Adrian was already moving, already shouting for his driver, already pulling his phone from his jacket to call ahead to security, and Isabella clung tighter to Emma's hand, refusing to let go. Her small face pale with a fear that seemed impossibly far older than her 6 years. "Please," Isabella whispered. "Please don't let him hurt her. She's waited so long for us to come back." Neither Emma nor Adrian had time to ask what she meant by that. The car was already waiting. The car tore through the city streets faster than Emma had ever ridden in her life. Adrian's driver weaving between lanes, while Adrian himself sat rigid beside her phone pressed to his ear, barking instructions to someone on the other end in a voice she barely recognized. "I want 2 men outside her building in the next 10 minutes. No, I don't care what else they're doing. Move!" Isabella sat pressed against Emma's side in the back seat, small fingers laced through Emma's, her face pale and tight with a fear that seemed too old for her years. "She's going to be okay," Emma murmured, more to herself than to the child. "She's going to be fine. Victor was just trying to scare us." "He doesn't just try things," Isabella whispered. "He does them." Emma's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Isabella didn't answer. Her small face had gone distant again, the way it had at the window, like she was listening to something only she could hear. Some frequency the rest of the world had lost access to years ago. Adrian ended his call and turned to Emma, his jaw tight. "Security will be there before we are. If Victor sent anyone, they'll see them coming." "You really think he'd hurt an old woman?" Emma asked, though even as she said it, she already knew the answer sitting in the pit of her stomach. "I think," Adrian said carefully, "that I've spent 20 years not asking myself what Victor Bellini is capable of, because the answer was never something I wanted to know. I'm done not asking." The car screeched to a stop outside Emma's building 12 minutes later, and Emma was out the door before it had fully stopped rolling, taking the 3 flights of stairs 2 at a time. Adrian close behind her. Isabella held tight against his chest. Emma's hands were shaking so badly it took her 3 tries to get the key into the lock. The door swung open. Clara was sitting exactly where Emma had left her that morning in her worn armchair, the television murmuring low, a cup of tea steaming untouched on the side table. Safe, unharmed. Utterly bewildered by the sudden, breathless arrival of her granddaughter, a strange man, and a small child all crowding into her tiny living room at once. "Emma," Clara said, setting down her crossword puzzle alarm spreading across her face. "What on earth is going on? Who are these people?" Emma crossed the room and dropped to her knees beside the armchair, wrapping her arms around her grandmother in a hug so fierce Clara made a small sound of surprise. "You're okay," Emma breathed. "You're okay. You're okay." "Of course I'm okay," Clara said, patting Emma's back with visible confusion. "Why wouldn't I be?" Behind them, Adrian set Isabella down gently, and the little girl immediately crossed the small living room, drawn it seemed by some invisible thread toward the old woman in the armchair. Clara's eyes found the child, and something in her face shifted a flicker of recognition that had no business being there, given that the 2 of them had never met. "Isabella," Clara breathed. Isabella stopped a few feet from the chair, staring up at Clara with wide, uncertain eyes. "How do you know my name?" the little girl whispered. Clara's hand had come up to cover her mouth, and tears were already spilling down her weathered cheeks. "Because I remember the day you were born," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I was the one who wrapped you in a blanket and put you in your mother's arms for the little time she had left to hold you." The room went completely silent. Emma pulled back from the hug, staring at her grandmother in shock. "You never told me you were there for the birth. You only ever said you worked her floor." "I didn't want you asking more questions than you already had," Clara said quietly, still staring at Isabella like she was seeing a ghost given flesh. "Some things are safer left in the past." Isabella took a slow step closer, studying Clara's face with the same searching intensity she'd shown Emma at the restaurant 3 nights earlier. "You were there," Isabella said softly. "I remember your voice. You sang to me. Before Mom, before she." Clara's breath caught audibly. You couldn't possibly remember that. You were less than an hour old. I remember feelings, Isabella whispered. Not pictures, just feelings. Warm hands. A voice that hummed. And then everything went cold and scared and loud, and nobody would tell me why Mom stopped moving. Adrian made a sound like he'd been struck, sinking slowly onto the arm of the couch, his face gray. She remembers the room, he said, disbelief and horror warring in his voice. She was an infant Emma. She shouldn't remember any of this. Maybe not with her mind, Clara said quietly, wiping at her eyes with a trembling hand. But the body remembers things the mind can't hold on to yet. I've seen it before in other children, though never quite like this. Trauma imprints itself somewhere deeper than memory. Emma stood pacing a tight circle in the small living room, her mind racing to keep up with everything unfolding faster than she could process it. Grandma, I need you to tell all of it, Emma said. Everything, not the version you gave me last night. The whole thing exactly as it happened, because Victor Bellini already knows where you live, and he sent me a text tonight that sounded very much like a threat. Clara's face drained of what little color remained. He knows about me, she said, not a question. He's known for a while, I think, Adrian said grimly. The question is, what he's afraid you remember. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant, traveling back through years she had spent very deliberately trying to forget. Sophia's pregnancy was complicated from the start, she said finally. Preeclampsia, high blood pressure, we were monitoring her closely for the last 6 weeks, but the delivery itself went well. Isabella was healthy, Sophia was stable, everything looked good for the first 2 hours afterward. And then, Adrian said, his voice tight. And then her blood pressure spiked and she began hemorrhaging, Clara said. It happens sometimes even after a successful delivery. It's frightening, but it's manageable if you act quickly. We called for an emergency transfusion. Her blood type was rare, AB negative, so the blood bank had to pull from a limited reserve, but we had enough on site. I remember placing the order myself and watching the clock, and the blood never came, Adrian said quietly, already knowing, having read this part in the sanitized version of the file 2 years earlier. It came, Clara said, nearly 3 hours later. By then it was already too late. Why the delay? Emma asked. That's what I couldn't understand, Clara said, her voice hardening with old buried anger. I checked the order myself multiple times. It had been logged correctly. But somewhere between the nurse's station and the blood bank, the request simply vanished. Nobody could explain it. When I demanded answers, I was told the paperwork had been misfiled. A clerical error. You didn't believe that, Adrian said. I've worked in hospitals for 30 years, Clara said. Clerical errors happen, but clerical errors don't happen to erase a single specific order in a chart belonging to the wife of one of the wealthiest men in New York on a night when the head of hospital administration personally came down to the maternity floor for reasons nobody could explain. Emma felt cold all over. What reasons? I don't know, Clara admitted. I only remember seeing him there, unusual for a man of his position to be walking the floor himself, speaking quietly with one of the senior nurses near the supply room. I thought nothing of it at the time. It was only after, when I started asking questions and got shut down so quickly and so completely, that I began to wonder if what I'd witnessed was more than coincidence. The hospital administrator, Adrian said slowly. Do you remember his name? Griffin, Clara said. Thomas Griffin. He retired not long after, moved somewhere down south, I believe. I never heard from him again. Adrian pulled out his phone immediately, typing something with sharp, urgent movements. I have people who can find him, he said. If he's still alive, I want to know exactly what he knows and exactly who paid him to look the other way that night. You think Victor paid him? Emma said. I think, Adrian said, that Victor has spent 20 years building a reputation as my family's most loyal friend, and I think that reputation has given him access to information, to leverage, to relationships that could make a hospital administrator very comfortable in his silence if the price was right. Isabella had climbed up onto the couch beside Clara, tucking herself against the old woman's side, with the easy, trusting familiarity of a child who had known her for years rather than minutes. and Clara's arm had come around the girl's shoulders, instinctively protectively. "Why would he want Sophia dead?" Emma asked. "What could he possibly gain?" Adrian's face had gone hard and distant, the look of a man working through a puzzle whose pieces he was only now beginning to understand. "Control," he said slowly. "My father built this family's empire from nothing. When he died, everyone assumed Victor would take over as the senior partner, guiding me through the transition until I was ready to lead independently. Sophia never trusted him. She used to tell me quietly that something about the way he watched our finances felt wrong. I never listened. I thought it was grief talking or paranoia or simple dislike." "What if she was right?" Emma said. "What if she found something and that's why?" The sentence hung unfinished in the air, too horrible to complete out loud. Adrian's hands had curled into fists on his knees. "If Victor had her killed," he said, voice shaking with barely controlled fury, "to protect whatever he was hiding in this family's finances, then he spent 4 years standing beside me at every holiday, every business dinner, every moment of my grief, knowing exactly what he took from me and from my daughter. We don't know that for certain yet," Clara said carefully, though her own voice trembled with the weight of the accusation. "We have suspicion and old memories, and a delayed blood transfusion that might have simply been a terrible, tragic mistake, and a threatening text sent to Emma within an hour of him learning about you," Adrian said. "And a little girl who somehow carries memories she shouldn't have access to, memories that seem to be leading us directly toward the truth of what happened that night." Isabella looked up at that, her small face troubled. "I'm not making it up," she said quietly. "I know it doesn't make sense, but I'm not making it up." "Nobody thinks you're lying, sweetheart," Emma said quickly, crossing to kneel in front of the girl. "We believe you. We're just trying to understand how." "Maybe," Clara said slowly, something shifting in her expression. "It's not so complicated as we're making it. Children who experience trauma before they have language for it sometimes carry fragments. Sensations, sounds, feelings that surface later when triggered by something familiar. A voice, a song, a face that resembles someone from that fragmented memory." "You think I remind her of her mother?" Emma said. "I think," Clara said, looking between Emma and Isabella with an expression Emma couldn't quite read, "that there might be more to it than simple resemblance." Before anyone could ask what she meant, Adrian's phone buzzed sharply in his hand, and his face changed the instant he looked at the screen. "It's my head of security," he said, already answering. "Go ahead." The voice on the other end was tinny, but audible in the quiet apartment, and Emma watched Adrian's expression shift from confusion to alarm to something close to horror as he listened. "Say that again," Adrian said sharply, more words too quiet to make out. "Where is he now?" Adrian demanded. "Is he secure?" "Good. Don't let anyone near him until I get there." He ended the call and for a moment simply stood there, phone still gripped tight in his hand, his face pale. "What is it?" Emma asked. "Adrian, what's wrong?" "Thomas Griffin," Adrian said slowly. "The hospital administrator Clara mentioned. My security team already had a file on him from when I first started digging 2 years ago. I never followed up. I couldn't handle it at the time." "And?" Clara pressed. "He's alive," Adrian said, "living outside Charlotte, and according to my head of security, he's been trying to reach me for the last 6 months. Left messages with my office that never made it to me directly." "Why would he be trying to reach you?" Emma asked. Adrian's jaw tightened. "Because 3 days ago, the same night Isabella pointed at you in that restaurant, someone broke into his home and went through his personal files. Nothing was stolen, but everything related to Lennox Memorial from that year was gone." The room went very still. "Victor knows we're getting close," Clara whispered. "Victor's always been ahead of us," Adrian said grimly. "The question is how far ahead and how much he's willing to do to stay there." Isabella's small hand had found Emma's again, gripping tight. And when Emma looked down, the girl's face had gone pale and distant in that unsettling way again, eyes fixed on some middle point in the room that held nothing visible to anyone else. "Isabella," Emma said softly. "Sweetheart, are you all right?" "He's not done," Isabella whispered. He's not going to stop just because we know. What do you mean, baby? Adrian asked, crouching in front of his daughter, his voice gentle despite the fear etched into every line of his face. Isabella blinked, coming back to herself slowly, confusion clouding her features the way it had before, as though she herself didn't fully understand the words that kept surfacing from somewhere she couldn't name. I don't know, she admitted, frustrated tears welling in her eyes. I just feel it, like something bad is still coming. Clara reached over and took the girl's other hand, holding it gently. It's all right to feel scared, sweetheart. Feeling scared doesn't mean something bad is definitely going to happen. Sometimes it just means your body remembers being scared before, and it hasn't quite let go yet. Isabella looked up at her with an expression of naked, desperate hope. Will you help me remember the rest, the good parts, not just the scary parts? Clara's eyes filled with fresh tears. I would love nothing more, sweet girl. Adrian stood, running a hand roughly through his hair, and Emma could see the decision forming behind his eyes before he spoke it aloud. I need to fly to Charlotte, he said. Tonight, if possible. If Griffin has been trying to reach me for 6 months, and someone just tried to erase whatever evidence he might have had, I need to get to him before Victor decides a burglary isn't enough to keep him quiet. You think Victor would hurt him? Emma said. I think Victor has already shown us tonight exactly how far he's willing to go to protect whatever he's hiding, Adrian said grimly. I'm not willing to gamble a man's life on the hope that he'll stop at theft. I'm coming with you, Emma said immediately. Emma, he knows where my grandmother lives, Emma said, cutting him off, her voice sharper than she intended. He's already threatened her, whether directly or not. I am not staying behind while you fly across the country to chase down the one man who might be able to explain what happened to your wife, while my grandmother sits here as an easy target for whatever Victor decides to do next. She has a point, Clara said quietly. And truthfully, I think I should come as well. Grandma, no, Emma said immediately. Absolutely not. You're not putting yourself back in the middle of this. I've been on the outside of this for 6 years, Emma, Clara said. And there was steel in her voice now. The steel of a woman who had spent decades being careful and quiet, and was suddenly finally done with both. I watched a young mother die because someone decided her life mattered less than their secrets. I let myself be frightened into silence, and I have regretted it every single day since. I am not staying behind now. Adrian looked between the two women, something like respect flickering across his exhausted face. Then we all go, he said. Together. My security team will secure this apartment in the meantime, and I'll have someone watching us every step of the way. Isabella tugged on her father's sleeve. I want to come too. Baby, this could be dangerous. You said Emma and Grandma Clara are coming. Isabella said, her small chin lifting with a stubbornness that reminded Adrian painfully of her mother. I'm not staying somewhere without them. Not again. I already lost people once because I wasn't there. The room fell silent at the strange heavy weight of that sentence spoken by a 6-year-old who had until 4 days ago not uttered a single word in years. Okay, Adrian said finally, his voice thick. Okay, baby. We'll stay together. The flight to Charlotte took just under 2 hours on Adrian's private plane, and Emma spent most of it staring out the window at the dark clouds below. Isabella curled asleep against her side, exhausted from the emotional weight of the evening. Clara sat across from them, quiet, watching the little girl sleep with an expression of tender grief that Emma didn't fully understand, until her grandmother spoke quietly near the end of the flight. She has her mother's hands, Clara said softly. I remember holding Sophia's hand the night she died, and Isabella's fingers are shaped exactly the same way. Emma looked down at the small hand curled against her side and felt something twist painfully in her chest. Grandma, she said quietly. Why did Isabella recognize you? Really recognize you, not just a feeling or a scent, but your face, your voice. She said she remembered you singing to her. Clara was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkness beyond the window. I sang to a lot of newborns over the years, she said finally, But something in her voice didn't sound entirely convinced by her own explanation. "That's not an answer," Emma said. Clara turned to look at her granddaughter, and for a moment something passed behind her eyes, some old grief or old secret that she wasn't ready to share yet. "There will be time for that conversation," Clara said quietly. "Right now, we need to focus on getting to this man Griffin before Victor's people do." Emma wanted to push, wanted to demand the truth her grandmother was so clearly holding back, but something in Clara's expression stopped her, some plea for patience that Emma, despite every instinct screaming, otherwise decided to honor for now. The plane landed just after midnight, and a car was already waiting to take them to a modest house on the outskirts of Charlotte, where Thomas Griffin, 78 years old and visibly frightened, opened his front door to find a Mafia heir, a waitress, an elderly former nurse, and a 6-year-old girl standing on his porch. "Mr. Moretti," Griffin said, his voice shaking. "I've been trying to reach you for months." "I know," Adrian said. "I'm sorry it took this long. May we come in?" Griffin's small living room was cluttered with old medical journals and framed photographs of a career spent in hospital administration, and he moved with the careful stiffness of a man whose body had grown fragile with age, and Emma suspected with fear. "They came 3 nights ago," Griffin said, once everyone was seated, his hands trembling as he poured coffee. Nobody had asked for, but everyone accepted out of politeness. "Went through my files. Took everything related to Lennox Memorial. I called the police, but nothing was technically stolen that had monetary value, so they didn't take it very seriously." "Why were you trying to reach me?" Adrian asked. Griffin set down the coffee pot and sank into a worn armchair, his face aging further in the dim lamplight. "Because I've carried something for 4 years that I should have told you the day it happened," he said. "And I got a call about 6 months ago from someone who made it very clear that if I ever spoke to you, my pension, my house, my safety, all of it would be at risk. I'm ashamed to say I listened. I've been a coward, Mr. Moretti, and I've regretted it every day since." "Who called you?" Adrian asked, his voice deadly quiet. "He never gave a name," Griffin said, "but I recognized his voice. I'd met him before several times at hospital fundraisers your family sponsored. Silver-haired man. Very charming." "Victor Bellini," Adrian said, and it wasn't a question anymore. Griffin nodded slowly. "The night your wife died," he said, "I received a call around 8 in the evening, hours before the emergency, instructing me to personally ensure that any transfusion request for a patient named Sophia Moretti be delayed. I was told it was a matter of, and I remember this phrase exactly, family business that didn't concern the hospital's operations." Emma felt the room tilt sharply. "You delayed the order yourself," Adrian said, his voice cracking with barely contained fury. "You knew, and you let her die." "I didn't know what it would mean," Griffin said, tears spilling down his weathered cheeks. "I swear to you I didn't understand. I thought it was some family matter, insurance, legal complications, something bureaucratic. I had no idea a woman's life hung on that delay. By the time I understood what had happened, it was already too late, and by then I was terrified of what would happen if I came forward." "Who paid you?" Adrian demanded, standing now, his whole body shaking with rage. "How much did it cost to let my wife die?" $50,000. Griffin whispered, unable to meet Adrian's eyes. "Wired to an account I closed years ago. I've spent every day since trying to convince myself it was an accident that I couldn't have known, but I did know Mr. Moretti. Some part of me knew exactly what I was agreeing to, and I did it anyway because I was afraid." Isabella, who had been sitting quietly beside Clara, suddenly stood. The room fell silent, every adult turning to look at the little girl whose face had gone pale and distant again, eyes fixed on Griffin with an intensity that made the old man visibly flinch. "You're the one from the hallway," Isabella said quietly. "The one Mom saw before it happened. She knew something was wrong. She tried to call for help, but nobody came fast enough." Griffin's face drained of all remaining color. "That's not possible. She was an infant." "I don't remember it like a memory." Isabella said, her small voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "I remember it like a feeling that never went away. Fear that never had anywhere to go, so it just stayed inside me until I met her. She pointed at Emma. And then it started coming out. Clara had gone very still, staring at Isabella with an expression of dawning, horrified understanding. "Adrian," Clara said slowly, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand I've kept this secret because I truly believed it was safer for everyone." Every eye in the room turned to her. "The night Sophia died," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Before the hemorrhage began, before anything went wrong, she made me promise something. She'd been having a difficult pregnancy complications that frightened her more than she let on to you, Adrian. She told me quietly, while you were down getting coffee, that if anything ever happened to her, she wanted me to make sure Isabella knew she was loved no matter what happened to this family." "What are you saying?" Adrian asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm saying," Clara said, tears streaming freely now, "that Sophia gave me something that night. A letter. She wrote it in the hours before the delivery, some instinct telling her something might go wrong, and she asked me to keep it safe to give it to Isabella when she was old enough to understand if anything ever happened." The room had gone utterly silent. "You've had a letter from Sophia," Adrian said, his voice shaking. "For 4 years, and you never told me." "I was frightened," Clara said. "After the threats, after I understood how dangerous this family's world could be, I convinced myself that producing that letter would only put a target on my back, and possibly on yours and on hers." She looked at Isabella. "I told myself I was protecting her by waiting." "Where is it?" Adrian asked. "Clara, where is the letter?" "Hidden," Clara said. "In a place I was certain no one would think to look." "We need it," Adrian said. "Now tonight, whatever it takes." Clara nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "It's in my apartment," she said. "Sewn into the lining of an old coat in my closet, one I haven't worn in years. I'll take you to it myself." Isabella crossed the room slowly and climbed into Clara's lap, small arms wrapping around the old woman's neck. "Thank you," she whispered, "for keeping it safe for me." Clara broke down completely, then holding the little girl tight, rocking her gently the way she must have rocked her own mother's newborn body 4 years earlier in a hospital room that had held both a beginning and an ending in the same terrible hour. Griffin, still sitting in his armchair, looked between the family reuniting in front of him and seemed to shrink further into himself. "Mr. Moretti," he said quietly, "I understand if you want to see me pay for what I did. I've lived with this guilt for 4 years, and I won't pretend I don't deserve consequences." Adrian turned to look at him, and for a long moment his face held nothing but cold, controlled fury. Then slowly something in his expression shifted. "You're going to give a full statement," Adrian said. "Everything. The call, the payment, the account, all of it. And you're going to do it in front of witnesses. I trust people who can make sure it holds up if this ever needs to go before the right authorities." "And then," Griffin asked, his voice small. "And then," Adrian said, "you're going to live with what you did exactly like you have been. But you're also going to help me make sure Victor Bellini answers for what he took from my family, because right now you're the only piece of evidence that connects him directly to my wife's death." Griffin nodded, tears sliding silently down his weathered face. "I'll do whatever you need. I should have done it 4 years ago." As the small group prepared to leave, Isabella still curled against Clara's shoulder. Emma found herself standing beside Adrian near the front door, both of them watching the elderly man behind them with complicated, exhausted expressions. "We're close," Emma said quietly. "Aren't we close to finally understanding all of it?" "We're close to something," Adrian said, his jaw, tight eyes distant with the weight of everything he'd just learned. "But Emma, I need you to understand something before we go any further. If Victor really is responsible for Sophia's death, if he really orchestrated all of this to protect himself, then he is not going to simply let us walk away with a signed confession and a 4-year-old letter." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Adrian said, his voice low and urgent, "that from this moment forward, every single person in this house tonight is in more danger than they were an hour ago. And I need to figure out before we land back in New York exactly how far I'm willing to go to protect all of you." Behind them, Isabella's voice drifted softly through the quiet house, still speaking, still finding words after 4 years of silence, telling Clara about a dream she'd had, one where her mother had been smiling, one where nothing had gone wrong at all. Emma looked back at the little girl, at the fragile, impossible miracle of her healing, and felt a cold certainty settle deep in her chest. Whatever came next, there was no going back now, not for any of them. The plane ride back to New York felt longer than the flight out, though the clock said otherwise. Every minute stretched thin by the knowledge sitting heavy in the cabin, the letter waiting in the lining of an old coat, the confession Griffin had given on record with trembling hands and a trembling voice, the certainty that Victor Bellini was no longer simply a suspicion, but a confirmed danger. Isabella had fallen asleep again somewhere over Virginia, curled between Emma and Clara, and Adrian sat across the narrow aisle, watching his daughter breathe, with an expression Emma had come to recognize over these last few days, the particular exhaustion of a man relearning how to hope, after years of believing hope was a luxury he'd already spent. "I keep thinking about the account," Adrian said quietly, not looking away from Isabella. "The one Griffin mentioned. $50,000 wired and closed years ago. If Victor was careful enough to close it down afterward, he was careful enough to make sure it couldn't be traced back to him directly." "But it existed," Emma said. "That's not nothing. It's a start," Adrian agreed. "But a closed account and a frightened old man's memory of a phone call aren't enough to bring down a man who has spent 20 years making himself untouchable. I need more. I need the letter. I need whatever Sophia knew before she died." Clara, seemingly asleep with her head tilted back against the seat, spoke without opening her eyes. "She knew something was wrong with the finances. She told me that night, though. She didn't say what exactly. Just that she'd found something she didn't understand, and that she was frightened of what it might mean." "You never told me that part," Adrian said, sitting forward sharply. "I'm telling you now," Clara said, finally opening her eyes, tired and sad. "I've spent 4 years trying to forget every detail of that night, Adrian. It's taken all of this, all of you, to shake it loose again." The plane landed just before dawn, and the car ride to Clara's apartment passed in tense silence. All 4 of them aware that whatever waited in that hidden coat lining might finally answer the question that had haunted this family for 4 years. Clara's hands shook as she pulled the old wool coat from the back of her closet, a garment faded with age, the kind of coat a person keeps out of sentiment rather than use. "I sewed it myself," she said, running her fingers along the inner seam near the lining. "The night after the funeral. I couldn't sleep and my hands needed something to do besides shake." She worked a small pair of scissors along the seam, careful, deliberate, and Emma watched her grandmother's fingers tremble as decades of careful silence finally came undone in a single unpicked stitch. A folded envelope slid free. Sophia's handwriting, elegant and slightly rushed, spelled out a single word across the front. "Isabella." Adrian's breath caught audibly. Isabella, awake now and standing close beside Emma, reached out one small hand toward the envelope, then hesitated, looking up at her father with an uncertainty that broke something in Emma's chest. "Is it okay?" Isabella asked. "Can I open it?" "It's yours, baby." Adrian said, his voice thick. "It's always been yours." Isabella's small fingers worked the envelope open with painstaking care, and she pulled out 2 pages covered front and back in her mother's handwriting and held them out toward her father. "Will you read it?" she asked. "I don't know all these words yet." Adrian took the pages with hands that shook harder than his daughter's had, and for a long moment he simply stared at his wife's handwriting. 4 years of grief crashing over him all at once. "My darling Isabella." He read, his voice breaking on the very first word. "If you are reading this, it means I did not get the chance to tell you these things myself, and I am so sorry for that, more sorry than any words on this page could ever hold." The room had gone completely silent except for Adrian's unsteady voice. "I found something 2 weeks ago that frightened me," he continued reading. "Money moving through accounts that don't belong to any business your father has ever discussed with me. I don't fully understand it yet, but I recognize the name attached to the transfers, and it is a name I never expected to see connected to anything hidden or wrong. I am telling your father tonight after the delivery, once I have the strength. I wanted to write this down first in case something happens because a mother's instinct told me to be careful, and I have learned to trust that instinct more than anything else in this life." Adrian's hands were shaking so violently now that Emma reached out instinctively to steady the pages. "The name is Victor." Adrian read, his voice cracking completely. "I don't want to believe it. He has been like family to us. But the transfers all lead back to accounts connected to him moving money out of the company in small enough amounts that no one would notice unless they were looking closely the way I was looking, because something about him has never quite sat right with me. Adrian, if you are reading this instead of me telling you myself, please be careful. And Isabella, my sweet girl, know that whatever happens, you were loved more fiercely and completely than any child has ever been loved. I am so sorry if I am not there to tell you that myself." Adrian's hand fell to his side, the letter trembling in his grip, and he sank slowly onto the edge of Clara's worn couch, his whole body shaking with 4 years of grief finally given somewhere to go. "She knew," he said, barely audible. "She knew, and she was killed before she could tell me." Isabella climbed into his lap without a word, small arms wrapping around his neck, and Adrian buried his face in his daughter's hair and wept 4 years of frozen grief breaking loose all at once in front of everyone in that small living room. Emma looked away, giving him the privacy of the moment, even in a room too small to offer real privacy, and found Clara watching her with an expression of quiet, sorrowful understanding. She was embezzling suspicions confirmed by a dead woman's handwriting. Clara said softly, "That's enough to bring a case, isn't it? Enough to finally make someone listen." "It's enough to start one," Emma said. But Adrian said it himself. Victor's spent 20 years making himself untouchable. A letter and an old man's confession might not be enough on their own. Adrian lifted his head, wiping roughly at his face, Isabella still curled against his chest. "It's enough to move," he said. His voice steadier, now hardened by something new. Something that looked almost like purpose. "I have accountants, forensic auditors who specialize in exactly this kind of hidden movement. If Sophia found something 2 weeks before she died, there will be a trail even 4 years old, even carefully covered. Money never disappears completely. It just gets harder to see." "And if you find it," Emma asked, "what happens then?" Adrian's eyes had gone hard, the dangerous stillness Emma had first seen across that dining room table returning in full force. "Then Victor Bellini answers for what he did," Adrian said. "To Sophia, to Isabella, to every year of silence this family has suffered because of his greed." The following days moved faster than Emma had time to process a blur of forensic accountants poring over years of financial records in a secured room at the Moretti estate of Griffin's recorded confession being reviewed by lawyers. Adrian trusted completely of careful, quiet meetings, meant to build a case strong enough that Victor Bellini would have no room left to maneuver. Emma found herself present for most of it, not because she had any expertise to offer, but because Isabella refused to be more than a room away from her, and Adrian, exhausted and grateful, had stopped trying to argue. "She trusts you in a way she doesn't trust anyone else right now," Adrian told her on the 4th night as they sat together in the estate's kitchen while Isabella slept upstairs. "I know I'm asking a lot, pulling you further and further into this. I know it's not fair to you. She needs someone who isn't drowning in grief and rage right now," Emma said quietly. "I can be that for a little while." "Is that all this is?" Adrian asked. "Something temporary until the danger passes?" Emma looked up, caught off guard by the question, by the vulnerability underneath it. "I don't know what this is," she admitted honestly. "A week ago, I was serving appetizers to strangers and worrying about rent. Now I'm sitting in a kitchen bigger than my apartment, tangled up in a murder investigation involving a man I'm apparently terrified of, and a little girl who calls me Mom, even though we've known each other for 4 days. "Does that scare you?" Adrian asked. "Terrifies me," Emma said honestly, "but not enough to leave." Something in Adrian's face softened the exhaustion and grief, giving way just briefly to something gentler. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not leaving. Whatever this becomes or doesn't become, I'm grateful you stayed." The forensic accountants found the trail on the seventh day. It had taken careful, patient work tracing shell companies through 3 different states, following money that had been deliberately meticulously hidden inside legitimate business transactions. But eventually the pattern emerged clean and undeniable, exactly as Sophia had suspected 4 years earlier. Exactly as she had died, trying to expose. Victor Bellini had been siphoning money from the Moretti organization for nearly 8 years. Small enough amounts each time to avoid detection, funneled through companies with names designed to look unremarkable, eventually totaling nearly $11 million. $11 million, Adrian said, staring at the report in disbelief, his voice flat with barely contained fury. He killed my wife to protect $11 million he was stealing from my own family. There's more, the lead accountant said, carefully sliding another folder across the table. The timing lines up almost exactly with Sophia's letter. 2 weeks before her death, there's a noticeable spike in activity transfers moved, faster accounts consolidated and closed. Someone was cleaning up quickly, like they knew they'd been discovered and needed to erase the trail before anyone else found it. He knew she found it, Emma said quietly. That's why he moved so fast to silence her. Adrian's jaw was tight enough that a muscle jumped visibly beneath his skin. I need to confront him. Tonight. Adrian, Clara said carefully from where she sat nearby, having become something of a permanent fixture at the estate over the last week. If this man was willing to have your wife killed to protect his secret, confronting him alone is not a wise decision. I won't be alone, Adrian said. I'll have my people, and I'll have this. He tapped the folder. Proof. Enough to finally end this. And if he doesn't go quietly? Emma asked, fear creeping into her voice despite her best efforts to keep it steady. Adrian, this is a man who arranged a murder and made it look like a medical tragedy. He's not going to simply confess and walk away peacefully because you show him a folder of bank statements. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, and Emma could see him weighing something dangerous behind his eyes. You're right, he said finally. I need to be smarter than that. I need him to believe he still has the upper hand right up until the moment he doesn't. That evening, Adrian called Victor and invited him to dinner at the estate, framing it as a peace offering after the tension of the previous week, an attempt to smooth things over between old family friends. Victor arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably as always, his easy smile firmly back in place, betraying nothing of whatever suspicion or calculation might have been happening behind his eyes. Adrian, Victor said warmly, stepping into the foyer. I'm glad you called. I was beginning to worry our friendship had taken a permanent hit. Old friendships weather storms, Adrian said, his voice carefully neutral, carefully warm in a way that made Emma's skin crawl from where she stood watching near the staircase. I overreacted the other day. I've had time to think, and I wanted to apologize. Victor's smile widened, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes, some small, careful assessment. I appreciate that, Victor said. It's been a difficult week for all of us, I imagine. How is Isabella? Thriving, Adrian said, and Emma could hear the effort it cost him to keep his voice light. You should see her. She hasn't stopped talking since that first night. It's like watching someone come back to life. Remarkable, Victor said, though his eyes had drifted toward Emma, now sharp and assessing, in a way that made her want to physically step backward. And Miss Carter's still around, I see. She's family now, Adrian said simply. And something about the finality in his voice made Victor's smile flicker, just for a moment, into something colder. Dinner passed with careful, strained pleasantness. Adrian steering the conversation through safe topics. Business updates. Old memories of Isabella's christening. Anything to keep Victor comfortable, unsuspecting, while the folder of evidence sat locked in a drawer just down the hall waiting. It was near the end of the meal over coffee that Adrian finally set down his cup and looked directly at Victor with an expression that had shed every trace of warmth. I found something interesting this week, Adrian said quietly. Financial records going back nearly 8 years. Very carefully hidden. Very cleverly disguised. Victor's hand, reaching for his own coffee cup, paused for just a fraction of a second. Is that so? Victor said, his voice still smooth, still easy, though something underneath it had gone very still. "What kind of records?" "Shell companies," Adrian said. "Money moving out of my family's organization in small, careful amounts over nearly 8 years, totaling almost $11 million. The dining room had gone very quiet. Victor set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "That's a serious accusation, Adrian," he said, his voice carefully measured. "I hope you're not implying what I think you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Adrian said. "I have documentation. Forensic accountants. A trail that leads quite clearly back to accounts connected to you." Victor's easy mask slipped just slightly, revealing something colder underneath something calculating. "Accusations like this," Victor said carefully, "could destroy a lot of relationships, Adrian. A lot of trust built over 20 years. Are you certain you want to go down this road based on the word of accountants you barely know?" "I also have a letter," Adrian continued, his voice hardening. "Written by my wife 2 weeks before she died. She found the same trail I did. She was going to tell me the night she died, Victor. The same night her transfusion request mysteriously vanished for 3 hours." The color drained slowly from Victor's face. "Adrian." Victor said, his voice tight now, all pretense of easy charm finally gone. "You need to be very careful about the story you're telling yourself right now. I also have a signed confession," Adrian continued, "from Thomas Griffin, the hospital administrator who personally delayed that transfusion order on instructions from a man he identified by voice, a man he'd met at fundraisers this family sponsored. Silver hair, very charming." Victor's jaw had tightened into something hard and dangerous, and for the first time since Emma had met him, the mask fell away entirely, revealing the cold, calculating man underneath. "You have nothing that would hold up," Victor said quietly. "An old man's fading memory. A grieving widow's paranoid letter. Accountants who could be paid to say anything if the price is right." "I don't need it to hold up in a courtroom, Victor," Adrian said, his voice deadly quiet, and Emma felt a chill run through her at the shift in his tone. The return of the man who had made a room full of dangerous men fall silent with a single flat sentence. "This isn't going to a courtroom." Victor's eyes widened slightly, real fear finally breaking through the careful composure. "Adrian," he said slowly, "think about what you're saying. Think about your daughter. Do you really want her growing up knowing her father?" "Don't." Adrian cut him off, his voice sharp as a blade. "Don't you dare use my daughter to justify what you did to her mother." "I didn't kill Sophia," Victor said quickly, desperately, now the composure fully gone, replaced by raw, naked panic. "I never intended for it to go that far. I just needed time. Time to move the money, time to cover the trail before she said anything. I told Griffin to delay things, I never told him to let her die. That was never the plan." The confession hung in the air, ugly and irreversible, and Emma watched Adrian's face go through something that looked like it might shatter him completely. Grief and fury colliding in an expression too raw to fully witness. "You just needed time," Adrian repeated, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You watched my wife bleed to death because you needed time to hide what you were stealing from my own family." "Adrian, please," Victor said, and Emma had never seen a man's composure crumble so completely so quickly. "We can fix this. Quietly. I'll return the money, every cent. I'll disappear. You'll never hear from me again. Just please think about what happens if this becomes public. The organization, everything your father built." "I don't care about the organization," Adrian said, and the words seemed to surprise even him as he said them. Some old certainty finally breaking loose and reshaping itself into something new. "I care about the fact that my daughter didn't speak for 4 years because she was carrying the trauma of watching her mother die in a hospital room you engineered." 2 men Emma hadn't noticed stepped forward from the doorway. Adrian's security, and Victor's eyes darted between them and Adrian with the desperate calculation of a man realizing too late that every exit had already been closed. "What are you going to do?" Victor asked, his voice small now, all the charm and confidence stripped away, leaving only fear. "I'm going to do what I should have done the moment I found that letter," Adrian said. "I'm turning everything over to the authorities. Griffin's confession, the financial records, Sophia's letter. All of it. And you're going to face what you did in a courtroom in front of everyone exactly the way it should have happened 4 years ago. Adrian, please, Victor said, standing now, his voice cracking with desperation. 20 years I've known you. 20 years I was there when you were born. I was at your wedding. Doesn't that count for something? It counted for everything, Adrian said, his voice breaking despite its hardness. That's what makes this so much worse. You were family. And you let my wife die, and you let my daughter grow up in silence because $11 million mattered more to you than either of their lives. The security team moved forward and Victor's composure finally shattered completely. His careful mask crumbling into something desperate and ugly. And for a moment, Emma feared he might do something reckless, might lunge for Adrian, or attempt some final desperate escape. Instead, he simply sagged, the fight draining out of him all at once, 20 years of careful deception finally collapsing under its own weight. You'll regret this, Victor said quietly as the security team moved to escort him from the room. You have no idea what you're unraveling, Adrian. There are people involved who won't be happy to see any of this come to light. Then they can answer for their part too, Adrian said. Every single person who helped bury the truth about my wife's death is going to face what they did. Victor was led away, his protests growing more desperate and less coherent as he disappeared down the hallway, and Adrian stood alone in the dining room afterward, his hands braced against the table shoulders, shaking with the release of 4 years of grief finally given somewhere real to go. Emma crossed the room slowly and placed a hand on his back, feeling the tremor running through him. It's over, she said softly. You did it. You found the truth. Adrian turned to face her. His eyes red-rimmed his face, a wreck of exhaustion and grief, and something that looked underneath all of it, like relief. It's not over, he said quietly. There's still a courtroom ahead of us. There's still the organization to deal with the people loyal to Victor, who won't be happy about any of this. There's still Isabella and everything she's going to have to process as she gets older and understands more of what happened to her mother. But the truth is out, Emma said. That has to count for something. It counts for everything, Adrian said, echoing Victor's earlier words with an entirely different meaning behind them. Emma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to know you can say no. Okay, stay, Adrian said. Not just until this settles. Not just until the danger passes. Stay because Isabella loves you, because He stopped, seeming to catch himself, some old caution rising up even now. Because this family needs you. Because I don't know how to explain what's happened between us these last 2 weeks. But I know I don't want it to end just because the immediate danger has passed. Emma felt her throat tighten, the weight of everything. The grief and the danger and the impossible fragile hope of it all pressing down at once. I don't know what I'm supposed to be in this family, she admitted quietly. A friend to Isabella. Something more to you. I don't have a map for any of this, Adrian. Neither do I, Adrian admitted. But I know that 4 days ago my daughter spoke her first words in 4 years because some instinct in her recognized something in you worth trusting. And I've spent every day since then feeling the same thing myself. Upstairs, unseen by either of them, Isabella stood at the top of the staircase in her pajamas, having woken to the commotion of Victor's departure, watching the 2 adults below with an expression of quiet, hopeful understanding far beyond her 6 years. She had waited a long time for this family to feel whole again. She didn't fully understand everything that had happened tonight. The money, the accounts, the confession that had finally exposed the truth about her mother's death. But she understood with the simple clarity children often possess that something broken was finally beginning to heal. She turned quietly and padded back to her room, climbing into bed with a small, satisfied smile, the first peaceful sleep she'd had in longer than she could remember, settling over her like a blanket. Downstairs, Emma looked up at Adrian, weighing 4 years of his grief against 4 days of impossible growing feeling, and made a decision that surprised her with how easy it felt to make. Okay, she said quietly. I'll stay. Adrian's face broke into something Emma hadn't seen from him before. Unguarded relief, unguarded hope. And for the first time since that rainy night in the restaurant, the Moretti estate felt, if only for a moment, like it might someday become a home, rather than a fortress built around old grief. But even as the warmth of that moment settled over them, Emma couldn't shake a small, persistent unease curling in the back of her mind. Victor's final words echoing in the quiet dining room. There are people involved who won't be happy to see any of this come to light. The truth had finally surfaced. But truth. Emma was beginning to understand rarely arrived without consequences trailing. The house did not feel safe again, just because Victor had been walked out of it. Adrian understood that better than anyone standing in that dining room, and by the time the last of his security team disappeared down the driveway with Victor secured between them, he had already begun making calls. His voice low and clipped, giving instructions that had nothing to do with dinner reservations or business deals, and everything to do with keeping 3 vulnerable people alive through whatever came next. "Double the perimeter tonight," he said into the phone, pacing the length of the foyer, while Emma stood watching, arms wrapped around herself against a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. "Nobody in or out without my direct approval, and I want eyes on every man who's ever taken an order from Victor Bellini starting now." "You think his people will retaliate?" Emma asked once he'd ended the call. "I think," Adrian said grimly, "that a man like Victor doesn't build 20 years of influence without loyalty he can call in when things go wrong. He has people. Men who owe him favors, men who've been paid quietly for years to look the other way. The second word gets out that he's been arrested, some of them are going to panic." "Panic and do what?" Clara asked, appearing in the doorway, with Isabella's hand held tight in hers, the little girl having been woken again by the tension humming through the house. "Panic and try to clean up loose ends," Adrian said quietly, glancing toward his daughter with an expression that made Emma's chest ache. "Which means tonight, none of you leave this house. Not for anything." Isabella tugged free of Clara's hand and crossed the foyer, wrapping herself around Emma's legs, the way she had that very first night, small and scared, and seeking the one anchor that had proven steady through everything. "Is the bad man gone?" Isabella asked, her voice small. "He's gone, baby," Adrian said, crouching down to her level. "He can't hurt anyone anymore." "But there are more bad men," Isabella said, and it wasn't a question. Adrian's jaw tightened, and Emma watched him war with the instinct to protect his daughter from the truth, against the instinct, apparently newly discovered, that honesty might serve her better than silence ever had. "There might be," he said carefully, "but I promise you, and I promise Emma, and I promise Clara, that I am going to do everything in my power to make sure none of them ever get close enough to hurt you again." Isabella studied his face with the same searching intensity she'd once reserved only for strangers who reminded her of her mother, and something in her small features settled some trust taking root that hadn't been there in years. "Okay," she said simply. "I believe you." The house went quiet. After that. The kind of tense, watchful quiet that comes after violence has been narrowly avoided, but not yet fully outrun. And Emma found herself lying awake in the guest room down the hall from Isabella's, listening to every creak of the old estate, every distant murmur of security radios outside. She didn't hear the door open until Isabella was already climbing into the bed beside her, small and silent in the dark. "Can't sleep," Isabella whispered. "Me neither," Emma admitted, pulling the covers up around them both. They lay there in silence for a while, and Emma thought Isabella had finally drifted off when the little girl's voice broke the quiet again, soft and uncertain. "Emma." "Yeah, sweetheart. Are you going to be my mom now?" The question landed like a physical weight against Emma's chest, and she lay there for a long moment, searching for an answer honest enough to deserve the question. "I don't know exactly what I'm going to be to you," Emma said finally, "but I know I'm not going anywhere. However that ends up looking, I'm staying." Isabella's small hand found Emma's in the dark, gripping tight, and within minutes her breathing had evened out into real sleep. The first untroubled sleep Emma had seen from her since that first chaotic night at the restaurant. Emma lay awake much longer, staring at the ceiling, feeling the enormous, terrifying weight of what she'd just agreed to. Not just to Adrian in that dining room, But to this child, now sleeping against her side, a child who had waited so long for someone to stay. The call came at 4 in the morning. Adrian's phone lit up the dark hallway outside Emma's door, and she heard his footsteps moving fast, heard the tension in his voice even through the closed door. And by the time she'd slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Isabella, Adrian was already standing in the hallway phone, pressed to his ear, his face carved from stone. "Say that again," he said sharply. Emma caught only fragments of the response, tinny and urgent through the phone speaker, but she saw the exact moment the news landed, watched Adrian's shoulders go rigid, his free hand curling into a fist against the wall. "Is he alive?" Adrian demanded. A pause. Then quieter, more controlled, though the fury underneath hadn't diminished at all. "Get everyone to the safe house. Now. I don't care what time it is." He ended the call and turned to find Emma watching him from her doorway. "What happened?" she asked, her stomach already dropping in anticipation of an answer she wouldn't want. "Griffin," Adrian said grimly. "Someone tried to break into his house in Charlotte 2 hours ago. He's alive, my security team got there in time, but whoever sent them wasn't playing games." "Victor's in custody," Emma said. "How could he have ordered this?" "He didn't need to order it from a cell," Adrian said. "He's had 20 years to build loyalty. All it takes is one phone call before his arrest, one instruction left in motion, and men who owe him everything will keep moving even after he's gone." "Who would do that for him?" Emma asked, fear creeping cold through her chest. Adrian's face had gone very still, the particular stillness Emma had learned to recognize as the moment before he revealed something he'd rather not say out loud. "There's a man named Dominic Russo," he said slowly. "He's run security operations for this family for almost 15 years. I trusted him. My father trusted him before me. If Victor had someone inside willing to move on his behalf even after arrest, it would have to be someone with that kind of access." "You think it's him?" "I think," Adrian said, "that I need to find out, and I need to do it before he realizes we're looking." The next several hours passed in a blur of tension. Emma hadn't known a house could hold Adrian moving through calls and meetings with a controlled urgency that reminded her again of exactly how dangerous the world he came from truly was. Clara keeping Isabella occupied with quiet games in the kitchen, while the adults around her carried the weight of a threat none of them fully understood yet. By mid-morning, Adrian's suspicions were confirmed. Dominic Russo had not shown up for his scheduled shift, had not answered any calls, and security footage from the estate's outer gate showed his car leaving the property at 3 in the morning, less than an hour after Victor's arrest, had likely reached him through whatever network of loyalty still connected them. "He's running," Adrian said, staring at grainy security footage on a laptop screen, his voice tight. "Which means either he's protecting himself, or he's cleaning up whatever mess Victor left behind before it can be traced back to him." "Or both," Emma said quietly. "Or both," Adrian agreed grimly. Isabella wandered into the room at that moment, drawn by the tension the way children often are, and stopped short at the sight of the security footage frozen on the screen, a car pulling away into darkness. "That's Dominic's car," she said quietly. Both adults turned to stare at her. "How do you know that?" Adrian asked carefully. "He used to bring me candy sometimes," Isabella said, frowning slightly. "Before I stopped talking, I remember his voice too. He was there the night everything went wrong, in the hallway with the other man." Emma felt the room tilt sharply. "Isabella," Adrian said, kneeling in front of his daughter, his voice carefully steady, despite the alarm plain on his face. "Are you saying Dominic was at the hospital the night your mother died?" Isabella's small face scrunched with the effort of reaching for a memory that had never fully belonged to conscious thought. "I think so," she said slowly. "I remember 2 voices in the hallway. One was the scared old man. The other one was Dominic. He wasn't scared. He sounded calm, like it was just a job." The implications of that settled over the room like a physical weight. "If Dominic was there that night," Adrian said slowly, "he wasn't just cleaning up loose ends this morning. He might have been part of it from the beginning." Which means he knows exactly how deep this goes, Emma said, and exactly what he needs to hide to protect himself. Adrian's phone buzzed again, and this time when he answered, his face went from tense to something closer to alarm within seconds. When? He demanded. Where? A pause longer this time, filled with a voice Emma couldn't make out, but whose urgency was unmistakable even through the phone's tiny speaker. Lock down the entire property, Adrian said. Nobody in, nobody out, and get me eyes on every camera we have. He ended the call and turned to Emma, his face pale. Dominic's car was just spotted 2 miles from here, he said, parked on a side road watching the estate. Emma's blood ran cold. He's coming here. Maybe, Adrian said. Or maybe he's just making sure we haven't found what he's afraid we'll find. Either way, I want everyone upstairs away from windows until my team clears the perimeter. The next hour passed with agonizing slowness. Emma sitting on the floor of Isabella's bedroom, with Clara, both of them keeping the little girl distracted with a picture book. Neither of them was truly reading, while downstairs Adrian coordinated with his security team in a voice Emma could hear rising and falling through the floor, tense and controlled. It was Clara who finally broke the silence between the three of them, her voice quiet, careful not to alarm Isabella further. Emma, she said softly, whatever happens today, I need you to know something. I've watched you these past 2 weeks become someone I barely recognize in the best possible way. You've always had a good heart, but I've never seen you fight for something the way you're fighting for this family. Emma looked up, throat tight. I didn't expect any of this, Grandma. Not the danger, not the family, not any of it. Nobody ever expects the things that end up mattering most, Clara said. Your grandfather used to say that. Life doesn't announce itself before it changes everything. Isabella, who had been quietly turning pages, looked up at both of them with an expression far too solemn for a child her age. Is Dominic going to hurt us? She asked. No, sweetheart, Emma said firmly, pulling the girl into her lap. Your dad isn't going to let that happen, and neither am I. A commotion downstairs interrupted whatever Isabella might have said next, raised voices, quick footsteps, and Emma's heart lurched with fear, until she recognized Adrian's voice among them, sharp with command, but not panic. Minutes later, Adrian appeared in the doorway, and the tension in his shoulders had shifted into something closer to grim satisfaction. We got him, he said. Dominic, my team took him into custody at the perimeter fence. Is he talking? Emma asked. He will be, Adrian said, his voice hard. He's already looking at charges connected to Griffin's attempted break-in this morning. And once he understands how much we already know about that night 4 years ago, I suspect his loyalty to Victor is going to evaporate very quickly. He was right. By that evening, Dominic Russo, facing the reality of decades in prison versus the possibility of leniency in exchange for cooperation, had given a statement that filled in the final terrible pieces of the puzzle. He confirmed everything Griffin had already revealed: the delayed transfusion order, the payment, Victor's involvement. But he added something none of them had expected, a detail that turned Emma's blood to ice the moment Adrian relayed it to her late that night, once Isabella had finally fallen asleep. He said Victor didn't act alone that night, Adrian said quietly, sitting across from Emma in the estate's kitchen, exhaustion and fury warring in his expression. There was someone else involved, someone even higher up than Victor, within the organization's old structure, someone who approved the plan before it ever happened. Who? Emma asked, though something in her chest already dreaded the answer. My father, Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dominic says my father knew Victor was skimming money, that he'd known for years and chose to look the other way because Victor's connections were too valuable to lose. When Sophia found the trail and threatened to expose it, Dominic claims my father authorized Victor to, and I'm quoting Dominic's exact words here, handle the situation quietly. The kitchen went silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Your father, Emma said slowly, knew his own son's wife was in danger, and he let it happen anyway. That's what Dominic claims, Adrian said, his voice hollow. My father died 18 months after Sophia. Heart attack, sudden, no warning. I always thought it was grief. Now I don't know what to think." "Do you believe Dominic?" Emma asked carefully. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his own hands, the weight of decades of assumed history crumbling in real time. "I don't want to believe it," he said finally. "But it would explain things I never questioned before. Why my father never pushed for a real investigation into Sophia's death. Why he insisted the case be closed quickly, quietly, no publicity. I told myself it was because grief made him want privacy. Now I wonder if it was because publicity would have exposed exactly what Dominic is claiming." Emma reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the tremor running through it. "Whatever the truth is," she said quietly, "you're not your father, Adrian. You've spent the last 2 weeks tearing down every wall of silence he ever built, chasing truth, even when it cost you comfort, even when it hurt. That's not the man Dominic is describing." Adrian's eyes met hers, raw and exhausted, and grateful in a way that made Emma's chest ache. "I want to believe that," he said. "I want to believe I'm building something different than what he left behind." "You already are," Emma said. "Look at what's upstairs sleeping right now. A little girl who spent 4 years in silence, and now she talks and laughs and asks about pancakes. That's not something your father built. That's something you're building right now with every choice you're making." The case against Victor Bellini moved faster than anyone expected once Dominic's cooperation was secured. The combined weight of Griffin's confession, the financial records, Sophia's letter, and now Dominic's detailed account of the night itself, proving more than sufficient for prosecutors eager to bring charges against a man who had for 2 decades seemed entirely untouchable. Emma sat beside Adrian in the courtroom on the day Victor's plea deal was finalized, watching the man who had once smiled so easily across a dinner table now sit hunched and diminished in an orange jumpsuit, all his careful charm stripped away by the weight of what he could no longer hide. He never looked at Emma or Adrian directly. Not once during the proceedings, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance as the judge read through the charges: conspiracy, embezzlement, accessory to negligent homicide. Each word landing like a small, quiet vindication for a truth that had waited 4 years to be spoken aloud. Outside the courthouse afterward, reporters clustered near the steps, drawn by the rare spectacle of a Moretti family scandal finally reaching public light. But Adrian moved through them with practiced calm, one arm around Emma's shoulders, guiding her toward the waiting car, without offering a single comment. "It's done," he said once they were inside the door, closing out the noise of the crowd. "After 4 years, it's actually done." "How do you feel?" Emma asked gently. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the courthouse steps disappearing behind them. "Emptier than I expected," he admitted. "I thought this would feel like victory. Mostly it just feels like grief, finally allowed to be grief, instead of a mystery I had to solve." "That makes sense," Emma said softly. "You've spent 4 years fighting for an answer. Now that you have it, there's nothing left to fight for except the actual loss underneath it." Adrian turned to look at her, something vulnerable and open in his expression that Emma had rarely seen from him, even in their most private moments. "I don't know how to grieve properly," he admitted. "I've spent so long being angry, being suspicious, being focused on finding the truth. I don't know what comes after that." "You don't have to know yet," Emma said. "You just have to let yourself feel it whenever it comes. And you don't have to do it alone." They arrived back at the estate to find Isabella waiting on the front steps, having refused to go inside, despite Clara's gentle urging, her small face anxious, until she spotted the car pulling up the driveway. She ran the moment the doors opened, throwing herself into Adrian's arms with the same desperate energy she'd shown that very first night at the restaurant, and Adrian lifted her easily, holding her tight against his chest. "Is it over?" Isabella asked. "Is the bad man gone forever?" "He's gone, baby," Adrian said, his voice thick. "He's never going to hurt anyone in this family again." Isabella pulled back to look at his face, studying it with the same careful intensity that had once made Emma's heart ache, and something in her small features seemed to relax, some final piece of tension finally releasing. "Good," she said simply. "Now we can just be happy. The word happy hung in the air, with a simplicity that made both adults' eyes fill with tears. The uncomplicated wisdom of a child who had waited 4 years for permission to feel something other than fear. The weeks that followed passed with a gentleness the family had almost forgotten was possible. Isabella returned to school for the first time in over a year, her teachers stunned and delighted by the transformation. A little girl who had once sat silent and withdrawn, now raising her hand in class, laughing at recess, making friends with the easy openness of a child finally allowed to simply be a child. Emma found herself settling into a rhythm at the estate that felt impossibly like belonging. Mornings spent helping Isabella with homework. Afternoons spent slowly, carefully building something with Adrian that neither of them had a name for yet, but both of them seemed unwilling to let go of. Clara moved into a small guest cottage on the estate grounds, insisting she wanted her independence, even as she spent most evenings in the main house, teaching Isabella to bake, telling her stories about her mother, that Adrian in his grief had never quite found the strength to share himself. She used to hum while she cooked, Clara told Isabella one evening, both of them elbow-deep in flour. Emma watching from the kitchen doorway, with quiet contentment. "Just like you do now, sweetheart. It's remarkable how much of her lives on in you." Isabella looked up, flour smudged across her cheek, her expression thoughtful in a way that had become familiar over these past weeks. "I wish I could remember her," Isabella said softly. "Not just feelings, real memories. Her face, her voice actually talking to me." Clara knelt down, wiping the flour gently from Isabella's cheek. "You have something better than memories, sweetheart. You have her letter telling you exactly how much she loved you. And you have all of us keeping her alive in the stories we tell. That's not nothing. That's actually everything." Adrian appeared in this doorway, then drawn by the warmth of the scene, and Emma watched his face soften at the sight of his daughter covered in flour, laughing at something Clara had said, so far removed from the silent, frozen child she'd once been. "I have something for you," Adrian said to Isabella once the baking had finished and the kitchen had been cleaned, pulling a small framed photograph from behind his back. Isabella took it carefully, and her breath caught as she studied the image, a young woman with dark curls and a warm smile holding an infant against her chest, both of them glowing with the particular joy of a first meeting between mother and child. "Is that me?" Isabella whispered. "That's you," Adrian confirmed, his voice thick. "1 hour old. And that's your mother looking at you like you were the most miraculous thing she'd ever seen, because you were." Isabella held the photograph against her chest, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. But for the first time, they weren't tears of confusion or fear. "Can I keep this?" she asked. "It's yours," Adrian said, "along with 100 more just like it whenever you're ready to see them." That night, once Isabella had fallen asleep with the photograph still clutched in her small hand, Emma found Adrian standing alone on the back terrace, staring out at the dark gardens beyond, his expression distant. "You okay?" she asked, joining him at the railing. "I keep thinking about everything Sophia never got to see," Adrian said quietly. "Isabella's first day of school, her laugh, the person she's becoming. 4 years, Emma. 4 years Sophia missed because of what Victor did." "She's not entirely missing them," Emma said gently. "I think some part of her would be so proud of who Isabella is becoming. And some part of her helped make that possible through that letter, through everything she tried to protect, even in her final hours." Adrian turned to look at her, and something in his expression had shifted, some final wall coming down that Emma hadn't fully realized was still standing. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need you to know I'm not saying this because of gratitude or convenience or anything except exactly what it is." Emma's heart began to pound. "Okay, I love you," Adrian said simply. "I think I've known it for weeks now, but I kept telling myself it was too soon, too complicated, too tangled up in grief and danger, and everything else this family has been carrying. But watching you tonight with Isabella, with that photograph, I couldn't keep pretending it was anything other than exactly what it is." Emma's eyes filled with tears. The weight of 2 impossible weeks, the fear and the danger, and the strange, unexpected tenderness of it all finally breaking loose all at once. "I love you too," she said. I think I have since that first night, when Isabella wrapped her arms around me, and I realized I couldn't walk away, even if every part of me was terrified to stay. Adrian pulled her close, and for a long moment they simply stood together on the terrace, the weight of everything they'd survived finally settling into something that felt unmistakably like the beginning of something new, rather than the aftermath of something broken. 6 months later, the Moretti estate looked nothing like the cold, guarded fortress it had once been. The security remained careful and thorough, but the atmosphere within those walls had transformed completely. Filled now with the sound of Isabella's laughter echoing through hallways that had once held only silence, with Clara's cooking lessons in the kitchen, with the easy, comfortable presence of a family that had been rebuilt from the wreckage of tragedy into something genuinely whole. Adrian had spent those months dismantling the parts of his father's organization that had allowed corruption like Victor's to flourish, unchecked, restructuring with a transparency that would have been unthinkable under the old regime, focused now on protecting the people connected to his family, rather than simply protecting power for its own sake. "You've changed everything," one of his oldest associates told him one evening watching Adrian help Isabella with a school project spread across the dining room table Victor had once sat at plotting betrayal. "Your father would hardly recognize this place." "Good," Adrian said simply, not looking up from the poster board he was helping Isabella glue together. "My father built something that let a man like Victor thrive for 20 years. I'm not interested in preserving that legacy." Isabella, absorbed in her project, suddenly looked up, her small face thoughtful in the way that had become so familiar over these past months. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, baby. Can Emma and Grandma Clara come to my school thing next week? The one where we talk about our families?" Adrian glanced toward the kitchen where Emma stood laughing at something Clara had said, flour-dusted across both their aprons, an ordinary evening scene that had once seemed impossibly out of reach. "I think," Adrian said, "they'd both want that more than almost anything." The following week, Isabella stood in front of her second-grade classroom, a poster board covered in photographs and drawings behind her, and told her classmates about her family, with the easy confidence of a child who had finally found solid ground beneath her feet. She talked about her father, who used to be very serious, but laughed more now. She talked about her grandmother Clara, who taught her to bake, and told her stories about a mother she barely remembered, but somehow through those stories had come to know deeply anyway. And she talked about Emma, the woman who had once been a stranger carrying a tray of empty plates, who had become in every way that mattered exactly what Isabella had called her that very first night. "My mom died when I was really little," Isabella told her classmates, her voice steady despite the weight of the words. "For a long time, I didn't talk about it because it was too hard. But then Emma came into my life, and she helped me find my voice again. And now I have two moms in a way, one who loved me first, and one who helped me learn how to be happy again." At the back of the classroom, standing beside Adrian and Clara, Emma pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely down her cheeks as Isabella's classmates applauded, unaware of the enormity of what they'd just witnessed. A little girl who had once gone 4 years without a single word, standing confidently in front of a room full of people telling her story without fear for the first time in her life. That evening back at the estate, the four of them gathered in the kitchen for dinner, an ordinary Tuesday night that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier, filled with easy conversation and Isabella's endless questions about everything from science homework to what kind of dog she might someday convince her father to let her have. "Adrian," Emma said once Isabella had finally been coaxed off to bed, and Clara had retired to her cottage for the evening, both of them sitting together on the back terrace under a sky full of stars. "I need to tell you something." "Anything," he said. "I don't regret a single moment of this," Emma said. "Not the fear, not the danger, not any of it. Because it led here to this, to all of you. I used to think my life was just going to be survival, one exhausting shift after another, never quite catching up. And now I have this family. I have Isabella. I have you." Adrian took her hand, threading his fingers through hers with a tenderness that had become as natural as breathing. "You didn't just find this family. he said quietly. You saved it. Every single one of us. Isabella found her voice because of you. I found the truth because of you. Clara found the courage to stop being afraid because of you. We saved each other, Emma said softly. That's what family does, isn't it? Nobody carries it alone. Isabella's small voice interrupted them from the doorway, having wandered downstairs in her pajamas, unable to sleep, drawn by the warm murmur of conversation. Are you guys talking about how much you love each other again? She asked, with the particular exasperated affection only a child can manage. Emma laughed, pulling the girl into her lap, as she settled onto the terrace bench between them. Something like that. Isabella looked between the two adults, her small face thoughtful, and then with the same startling clarity she'd shown that very first night at the restaurant. She said the word that had once seemed impossible, the word that summed up everything this broken, healing family had fought so hard to become. Family, Isabella said softly, holding both their hands in her small ones. We're a family now, for real. Adrian's eyes filled with tears he no longer bothered to hide, and Emma felt her own throat tighten with the overwhelming weight of everything that single word carried. 4 years of silence finally broken, a truth finally uncovered, a family finally completely whole. Yes, baby, Adrian said, pulling both of them close against him under the wide star-filled sky. We are a family, now and always. And in that quiet moment high above the city that had once seemed so dangerous and unforgiving, 3 broken lives finally settled into something whole, proof that even after the deepest silence, even after the darkest betrayal, love always finds a way to speak the truth.